That's why I like to use the word aesthetics rather than art, because you can have aesthetic experiences of nature, you can have aesthetic experiences of food, you can have aesthetic experiences across the board. We've developed this instrument, and we've collected data. This is not published yet, but we're in the process of developing it, of asking exactly the question that you're raising, is that if you, for example, spend money and go and listen to a chamber orchestra versus you go to your church or your temple and you hear a group of people singing or chanting, right? Why is one thing regarded as art and the other is not?
Good morning, Anjan.
How are you?
I'm fine, thank you. It's so great to meet you here on Zoom.
Likewise.
I just thought when I read about everything you do, I thought it must be tricky to introduce yourself at a dinner party.
Um, why do you say that?
No, because you do a lot. I mean, you're a professor of neurology, psychology, architecture, and you're also involved in neuroaesthetics.
Right. Yeah. I mean, people are sometimes interested, sometimes not. Everybody in dinner parties is more interested in themselves than other people, so it's really not.
That's true.
It's not much of a concern. If you stay quiet, you stay quiet.
Oh, okay. But I'm interested also in knowing that as a child, were you interested in science, and how did this path, or how did you follow this path?
Yeah. So as a child, I grew up in India, and I was interested in the sciences, but also I went to a school taught by Jesuits from Spain. And as part of our curriculum, in addition to math and English and geography and history, we always had an art class. So art was just built
Really?
into the education from the very beginning. Um, so there was that. I drew a lot growing up and continued. And then once I was in medical school, and after that time became, it was harder to keep doing that. But then I switched at some point to photography and was quite preoccupied by that. So this kind of preoccupation with aesthetics, visual aesthetics, has been with me for quite some time. And when I uh, started training in neurology, the thing that was most interesting to me was the nature of the human mind and how that is expressed and constrained by properties of the brain. So I became a cognitive neurologist and a cognitive neuroscientist, and started out my career thinking about how we pay attention in the world, how language works, how consciousness works. Those were all of the things I was interested in. And about 25 years ago, I started to incorporate the study of aesthetics into my research portfolio, and over time that started to get bigger and bigger. So at the time, in the late 1990s, virtually nobody was doing any of this work, and the cultural zeitgeist has changed where people have gotten more interested. And so in 2018, I started the center I have now, the Penn Center for Neuroaesthetics. So this has become the dominant piece of how I spend my time, thinking about it, doing research in it. And I'm an experimentalist, so it constrains the kinds of questions we can ask and what we can say. Uh, and uh, but when it all works, it's a lot of fun.
But your inquisitive side. I mean, you must have been also as a child then inquisitive, because if I hear also of everything you do, it's almost as if you want to know. I think you know something, and then you want to know more, and you follow that route of there must be more, or there must be more that I don't know.
Yeah, I think that's true. I think that's true for most scientists, or at least scientists who care about what they do. Uh, Aristotle said all knowledge begins in wonder, and I think curiosity and wonder are uh, fundamental to what most investigators do. That's what drives us. So I think that's generally true. I think people who don't retain that sense of curiosity and wonder about the world end up burning out. In their 40s and 50s, they uh, burn out, and people follow different paths. Some people become administrators, some people go into industry, and uh, I don't mean to denigrate those paths. Everybody has their route, but that core sense of every investigation just about opens up new questions. And so there's always and sometimes you go down dead ends and cul-de-sacs, and, you have to pull back and move in another direction. But I think wonder really drives most people who sustain their scientific career for a long time. The other big advantage, I think, is having students, and so having young people around, and uh, they're not burnt out yet. So their curiosity and their what they find fascinating is another source of inspiration, I think. Going back to your earlier question about the whole world of neuroaesthetics, um, the much of it, I think, in the last 8 years has been driven by young people, kind of older institutional organizations tend to be quite conservative, and so they don't know what to make of this, but much of the energy is coming from younger people, which is heartening to see because it speaks to a future of this field in a way that once the people who have more rigid boundaries about what one should do or what one should study or what lanes people should um, inhabit, once they have died off, I think there will be more openness to this.
But do you think, as a child, when you did art, or when you had art as part of your education, that also helped you see things differently? That you had, um, through that, these skills that developed through doing an art form, that you then could apply that to also in a science, world.
Yeah, I mean, not in any explicit fashion. So it wasn't in my head that I'm doing this, that's helping me do that. It
Yeah,
all
yeah.
happened a little more organically. Dorothea Lange, who's a photographer, I may get the quote not exactly right, but said something like, using a camera is a way to help you learn how to see. And so I think, if you draw and you use cameras, that's there's a way in which it opens you to looking at the world without when you're not drawing and when you're not
Seeing.
using a camera. So I think that's certainly true. I think the science, whether that had a direct impact on my interest in science, I don't know. I can't tell. There are plenty of very good scientists who are have not been artists. So I think there are some parallels about how one approaches a problem, how one thinks creatively. There are some overarching similarities. I think then the process starts to diverge when you actually get into it. The rules are very different.
Yeah, because I'm just always wondering if those skills, that you built, maybe not that you're conscious of it, but there are skills that, say, a child, for example, who learns to play an instrument. There's so many little things, that you learn by playing this instrument, and also the skill of perseverance, the skill of attacking something that you haven't played before, that we don't always see, but we just think of the instrument, or the child has to paint, but that these very subtle skills then you transfer to whatever you then do in life.
Yeah, I think that sounds right to me. It's hard to have perspective on my own life to generalize from that, but that sounds right to me. I think it's one of any domain where people strive for a certain kind of excellence. So I would say sports is similar. That that you have to practice, you try to be better, you have to persevere. There's a kind of excellence there. Depending on the sports, there's a kind of elegance and aesthetics to it that goes beyond just the winning. So often I find that also people who persevere in the sciences have had a background in sports of some kind as well.
Yeah.
So I think there are these different
Yeah.
avenues that people can take or have been presented to them in their development that provide what you're saying is a kind of skill, a kind of almost a meta skill of how do you approach life, and how do you uh, develop forms of resilience. So,
But you did research on how we see beauty and how we experience art.
yes. So what's your question?
Yeah, I want to know how. But first of all, what made you want to do this research? What was the sort of what sparked this idea?
Yeah, so it was about 26 years ago. I was moving from my previous position at the University of Alabama in Birmingham and coming to Penn, University of Pennsylvania in Philadelphia, where I am now. And this was because this university was starting a center for cognitive neuroscience. And in the late 90s, early aughts is when cognitive neuroscience started to take off. And this university was one of a few universities in America that decided that they wanted to invest in this. So I was recruited for that, but it was also an opportunity for me to think through. It was a break point of what it was I wanted to do and continue with my work. And it came out of a conversation with some friends where I realized that I had always been interested in aesthetic practices and aesthetics in general. And if I didn't, as someone who is interested in the nature of the human mind, if I didn't incorporate that into some of my academic work, that would be unfortunate. So at the time when I came here, I did something that many of your younger listeners will not have experience with, which is I went physically to the library and walked through the stacks
Yeah.
of journals to see, is anybody even writing about this? So, and I came across a journal called The Empirical Studies of the Arts, and I started looking through it. There was no neuroscience in there, it was mostly psychology. Uh, but the experiments were interesting, and people were asking the kind of questions that I was interested in. I didn't realize that there were people actually doing this kind of work. and not many, but there are a few dedicated people. And at the time, most people who did this uh, kind of investigation did it on the side, in the sense that they had their more traditional work and then they did these experiments. People tended to be amateurs in the best sense of the word, which is that they did it because they loved it, not because they were getting any external rewards for doing this kind of work. But this group, their first meet or their meeting, next international meeting, was in Japan. I'd never been to Japan. I didn't know this group, so I decided to just go and meet them. It's a lovely group of people, and um, so that's how I got involved organizationally. Uh, but as I say, it was always work on the side, and it only gradually started to become more dominant in my work. And as a neurologist, the first kinds of questions I started to ask was what happens to artists when they have brain damage? So if people have neurologic disorders, does this affect their art? How does this affect their art? And so on. And so I started combing the literature for that and trying to see what I could glean. And there's a phenomena that I've written about, or at least was writing about back then, was it's referred to as the paradoxical facilitation of art, which is that in some instances, when people develop neurologic disease or damage, their art actually gets better, or is viewed by others as being better. And
Really?
so, and my, um, I want to be clear that the argument is not that you should get some brain damage if you want your art to get better.
Mm.
But there are enough instances of this that it raises questions. And it's a, a curious thing, because if you think that our artistic and creative output is among the highest of expressions of our human capacities, when you have brain damage, you don't ever have situations where your language gets better, your perception gets better, your emotions are better regulated, your decision making gets better. How is it possible that this thing
Um,
that we like to put up on a pedestal can actually get better with less of a brain,
mm.
right? So that's the paradox part of it. Um, I think the upshot of most of that work is that art is not, to me, is not a natural kind, in the sense that it's not one thing, right? We use this word to describe a lot of things, and we use the word to describe a lot of ways of depiction that that there is no one center in the brain for art. This kind of idea that was popular in the 70s, of the right hemisphere being the kind of residual for the artistic brain, is just categorically wrong. Right? There's has no real basis. So, so what you find is that depending on the nature of the brain damage and where in the brain uh, some of the hardware is affected, that the expression, if, again, this is a big if someone is still motivated and has the desire to produce, that what happens is the channels of production just find alternate routes. So if you can't take one route, it comes out in another way, and that's going to be constrained by what brain is preserved. So what you end up having, right? So for example, if we take just famous artists, one would be hard pressed to say what Mark Rothko did is similar to what Rembrandt did, right? But we call them art. And so I think what you're seeing in these instances is that when one has a certain kind of brain damage and their habitual way of producing art is interrupted, they still have the motivation and the ability to produce art, it finds another channel, and so what comes out is different. And in some instances, um, people think it's actually better than what they did before, or at least more novel or more different. So that was where I started.
But if you say that it takes in a different route, do you think this is also why we sometimes also see that art has this healing effect on people?
Yeah, I don't know if that parallelism works. I think the healing effects. So right now, art and health is a big topic, right? You read a lot about it. People are talking about it. The actual um, the concrete evidence is not commensurate with the enthusiasm for the idea.
Oh, I see.
So, and which is not to say it might not work. It's just that the research hasn't really been done and hasn't been done well. There are instances. So we recently published a review asking the question of whether art in clinical spaces and hospitals and other clinical spaces is helpful. And as best we can tell, that particularly art of nature is helpful in certain instances. That where people tend to be quite anxious. So, for example, before they're getting a surgical procedure or they're in recovery, in those kinds of instances, having that kind of art helps people to calm down. Um, but as as a researcher, these questions raise all sorts of questions, which is who are we talking about? What kind of patients? In what setting? Right? If you're in a waiting room, is that different than if you're about to go into an assisted living or nursing home, or if you're in a long-term rehab? If you're in a place that you're only going to be there for an hour before something happens, is that different than if you're going to be in a hospital for 2 weeks? Uh, is it the case that if you're in a place in a prolonged way, is perhaps abstract art might be more interesting because it engages you and you have a relationship with it in a way that a pretty picture of a landscape, you see it, you feel good about it, and then maybe you don't engage with it very much.
Yeah.
So there are all of these questions that if you just start out with the proposition that art is good for health, right? Unless you start dissecting that and say, under what conditions for whom, right? If you think of this as in the same way you might think of a medical intervention, what's the dose, right? How much art should someone have? And how do you measure a change? Right. So those are all of the kinds of questions we obsess over. And then what's a control condition, right? Do you say, is art different than nature, for example, right? Could it be that if there's a garden and you take a walk in the garden, is that just as good, maybe better? So these are all of the questions one is forced to ask and um, not just to rely on our intuitions that art is good for us. And that's part of what I think we bring to the table is that we are not, for us, intuitions and insights that very smart people have are the beginning, not the end, right? That's where you start. And then you have to find out, is it actually true? Who is it true for? In what form? How do you measure it? How do you establish that this is helpful? And my own view is art is such a powerful tool that it can also be used in nefarious ways, right? It can be used for propaganda, it can be used for misinformation. That right, art is not inherently good or bad. I think it's the context in which it's presented and how it's used. And the other part of this is that art, I don't think, has to be justified with a purpose, right? It doesn't have to be transitive. People can do art purely for the sake of doing art. I think this idea that art needs to serve a purpose, I think it's great when it does, but I don't believe it has to, that without that, it has no value.
But do you think we tend to put art, sort of in a box and say, well, this is art and this is not art, or the way you do it, and that it's much more? Because if you talk about how do we enjoy art or how do we see beauty, then it must be in more than just painting or dancing or the categories that we put art in.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. One of the things we have developed is an assessment of aesthetic participation. That's why I like to use the word aesthetics rather than art, because you can have aesthetic experiences of nature, you can have aesthetic experiences of food, you can have aesthetic experiences across the board. We've developed this instrument, and we've collected data. This is not published yet, but we're in the process of developing it, of asking exactly the question that you're raising, is that if you, for example, spend money and go and listen to a chamber orchestra versus you go to your church or your temple and you hear a group of people singing or chanting, right? Why is one thing regarded as art and the other is not? And sometimes in surveys, at least in the US, the claim is made that people who are belong to underrepresented groups don't participate in the arts. And we're not sure that that's true. We think it might mean that they don't go to fancy museums as much. They don't go to, pay a lot of money to go to listen to orchestras. But there is a kind of everyday aesthetics that people are just as engaged in. And so we've created this instrument to try to get a fuller account of what kind of aesthetic people have from, the what have traditionally been referred to as the arts versus other situations. And especially now, with the advent of digital media, right? So many more people are involved in digital media, and to say that somehow that is not art, one can have opinions on the quality of the art, but people are very involved in things like Instagram and other sorts of visual media and are being creative with it as well. So, trying to understand the way in which people engage in person, the way people engage digitally, the way people consume or receive art, and the way people produce art, trying to get a whole range of those, of again, as we label it, aesthetic participation, as opposed to thinking of art in a very narrow way.
I'm thinking now that you're talking about, I'm from South Africa, and I've spoken also to a few African artists, and art actually is part of their culture. They used to build houses of clay and paint it different colors, but it was not what we see now. We look at it now as, oh, it's beautiful, it's art. Yes, of course, it was for them beautiful, but it was more of storytelling, and it was more of a cultural idea. And is that also then that real, that inherent in us or in the brain that we want to see beauty around us, or that we want to make things beautiful?
I think so. I think as far back as you go, you have evidence that people would, that there's a decorative instinct, at least, to take things that were functional, but also make them attractive. And this goes, I mean, from South Africa, the Blombos Caves, I think there's, evidence from, I might get the timing wrong, but I think around 80,000 years ago of sort of decorations on the walls, geometric decorations. And the use of ochre, for example, was a color that was used not purely for its functional purposes, but for decorative purposes. So I think this instinct has been there. And sometimes when people ask me, why does aesthetics matter? Uh, the answer is I find easier to give if we think in the negative. So, what do I mean by that? If we imagine a world where all our needs are met, so we have adequate nutrition, we feel safe, uh, but it's in the absence of any aesthetic experiences. So we all wear exactly the same clothes that keeps us warm. We live in the exact same kinds of housing that keeps us safe from the elements, but there's no variability. Our food provides us with perfect nutrition, but there's no flavor, right? And is this a kind of world that we would like to live in? And without exception, people think that this would be horrible. That if there isn't some element of decoration, some element of um, elements that evoke experiences of joy, of wonder, of awe, that this is not a life that is particularly appealing to live in. And so if I think most people now would share this intuition, there's no reason to think that in the distant past that was any different. And so the expression of that desire to create moments of joy, of delight, of surprise, it's hard to imagine that that hasn't been with us for a very long time.
And how do you measure, for example, if different people look at a different artwork, uh, how they experience it? Because we don't see, it's that saying, in the eye of the beholder. So we don't see art. We don't all see art the same way. So how is this measured?
Yeah. So my glib response often is that art is not in the eye of the beholder; it's in the brain of the beholder, and our brains are more similar than they're different. Right. So that's the glib response. But to unpack that, um, we know from empirical work, if you ask the question of beauty, there is more consistency when we're talking about natural kinds. So, beauty in faces, beauty in bodies, beauty in natural landscapes. People tend to be more consistent. And people tend to be less consistent when it comes to human artifacts. So, architecture and art, right? And those are much more variable. Uh, we um, a couple of things. We have framed our aesthetic experiences in the context of what we refer to as the aesthetic triad. So, what that is, the three parts of that one node are the kind of sensory motor qualities of what you're looking at or what you're engaging with, and how our own sensory and motor systems constrain what you can experience. So, for example, there's in a sunset, there's all sorts of information in the infrared spectrum that we don't apprehend, right? So our experience of that natural phenomena is limited by the sensory apparatus we have. And so our sensory apparatus in general constrains and guides the kind of aesthetic experiences we can have. Then the question is, what are the emotions evoked by that? So when it's beauty, almost always there's pleasure. Pleasure seems to be integral to beauty. But there might be other admixtures of emotions, and sometimes the most interesting works of art have both combinations of positive and negative experiences in it, embedded within it, right? They're never just simple, it's not like a piece of sugar on your tongue. They tend to be more complex and nuanced emotions. And the third is the semantics and meaning that we bring to bear on what we're looking at. And that's where there's a lot of variability, which is, your experience growing up in South Africa, my experience growing up in India, the fact that you are now in Vienna, I'm in Philadelphia, maybe your educational background is different than my educational background, and what point in history we're living, right? We're now at this, right? So all of those things, our education, all of those, all of those factors come into play in how we experience something, how we interpret it. And then separate from that is the idea that there are across the board individual differences. So just a couple of things that we know from our work, and not just our work, but the work in the field. People who are more open to experiences. So this is one of the personality factors that people talk about. People who tend to be more open to experience also tend to be more open to engaging with art. So some people tend to be more conservative, and I don't mean in a political sense, but more conservative, the sense that they like to do what they do. They don't want a lot of novelty in their life. They tend to be less open to experience, don't engage with art in the same way or as much. The other is people's experience with art. The classic example is that people who have had no experience with art as part of their education or their upbringing tend not to like abstract art. They look at it and say, what is this about? My kid could do this. I don't know why anybody cares about this, right? So I think that's another factor that we know is quite different. The question of measurement is something we're quite preoccupied by, and we have developed a taxonomy of how to identify what the experience is. The analogy there would be like wine tasting that people have some sense of, right? You sip some wine, you might say, I like it, I don't like it, or it's kind of interesting, I'm not sure if I like it, and then many people get stuck. But if you have a sommelier who then gives you a set of terms, right, that there are hints of vanilla, there's some blackberries in it, and so on and so forth, people can identify, right? So this is a, a well-known phenomenon in psychological research, which is people are better at matching things than generating them. So if you're told there might be this taste and you can identify it, that's easier than to come up with what that taste actually is. So we have developed a taxonomy for what one might be experiencing with art, and using that in research along the same lines is that if you are now looking at something and we give you a set of terms and you are querying yourself about, is this match with what my experience is, right? That gives us a way to try to measure the impact of art on people. And then there's kind of more physiologic things and other, brain imaging that we do as well. But for us, it always starts with behavior. I think sometimes people make what, in my view, is the mistake to think that the physiology is going to answer something for you that behavior is not going to tell you. And I think that's a mistake. The physiology is very interesting, it's very informative, but the idea that you can stick someone in an MRI scanner and they're going to reveal the truth of the matter when you don't know what question you're asking is simply wrong.
Well, I thought of that. I thought, it's like physiologically that you can measure some sort of reaction, but it makes total sense when you talk about that all these other things are playing a huge role in how we see it or how we experience
Yes.
it. Yeah.
So yeah, and I'll give you a good example. So something that you see quite commonly is people will say, there's a whole commercial market for devices that uh, are supposed to uh, index people's aesthetic experiences. So, and most of them are make promises that they can't deliver. A good example is if you think about uh, our sympathetic responses. So people will have devices of, like that there's an increase in heart rate and
Yeah.
increase in skin conductivity, when you're apprehending certain things. The problem with those kinds of measurements is that those are simply measures of arousal of our sympathetic nervous system output. Now, that could be because you're excited. It could be because you are afraid. It could be because you're angry. Anything that arouses you is going to produce the same kind of physiology in those measures. It doesn't tell you anything about whether this is a good experience, is it a bad experience. And so I think it's an example of how there is, I think, an undue reliance or belief in physiology. And I mean, this is my career, so it's not as though I don't care about the physiology, but the physiology without an understanding of behavior ends up being far too unconstrained and has the potential role of misleading and seducing people into thinking we know something that we don't.
Oh, yeah. But did you, when you do these, or when you did these, or the research, was there something that really surprised you that you really didn't realize?
I think sometimes, yeah, some of the things that we have found, for example, that there are in the brain, there are responses to beauty, even when people are not thinking about beauty. That we find, we've done this with faces, that we find that people are responsive to beautiful faces, even when they're being asked something completely different. And it seems as though there's an automaticity to this response that, and similarly, we've done a fair amount of work looking at facial anomalies, so disfigurements, where people who have scars and burns and developmental abnormalities. And in the same way that there is a beauty is good stereotype, we find that there is a facial anomaly is bad stereotype, that people tend to think that if someone has these kinds of disfigurements, that people are less competent, less warm, less intelligent, less trustworthy, and so on. And we've done a fair amount of work at that. And that also happens automatically. But within that, there are some variability of how within the brain, how there are different levels of response based on how much the kinds of biases people have. And so some of that has come as a surprise. In the work in architecture, one of the things that we have found is that, which also came as a bit of a surprise, is that there seems to be three fundamental constructs that accounts for much of our experience of architecture, which is coherence, how organized is a space,
Ah,
fascination, how much informational complexity is there? Do you feel like you want to explore it? Is it hold your interest? And hominess, which is uh, how comfortable are you in this space, right? It can be a very beautiful place, but you don't feel like you belong there. So hominess is that sense of there's a personal connection to the space. So even those constructs came as a surprise because they account for a lot of how people respond. And we found that these responses are encoded in the brain even when people are not aware of these constructs, so that different parts of our visual system are responding to these three components. And I know you mentioned that you have interviewed Hugo Spears as well. His lab actually replicated our findings, which always makes you feel good if another lab does something and you were not involved in the creation of the experiments, but they basically replicated those three constructs and the neural basis for it. So we feel as certain as one can be as a scientist that these are real and that neural responses are embedded, and that the broader implication of both talking about faces and the built environment is, and this is stretching from the actual data, but I think that we are always responding to the aesthetics of our environment, whether it's the built environment, natural environment, or people in our environment. We are always responding to the aesthetics of that, even when we're not conscious of doing so.
And do you think also this is why we perceive, um, you say this, I'm just thinking now that could this also be that if you're in a concert hall, for example, or if you're in an art gallery, that you experience that, what you see in front of you or what you hear, that you experience that differently than, for example, sitting in your living room and having the painting in your house?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think so. I think there are at least two broad differences in those examples. One is the the physical layout, the physical environment in which you're experiencing it, and the other is the social environment, right? You're, a concert hall, or if you're going to a museum with friends, or there are other people around. Those are two big pieces that make those experiences different. And in some cases, uh, it's not a given that being in the live setting is actually better, right? So there are some people who find it distracting to have all these people around, or that, if you don't have a good seat, the acoustics aren't as appealing, and so on and so forth. So we have looked a little bit at this question of the difference between experiencing art in a museum and not in a digital setting. And this is young people now, so I want to be very clear about the limits of our research. We find there's not a lot of difference in people's experience of art, going the same art, we've done this in two museums in Philadelphia and having people come to a lab and looking at them on a
Really?
screen. We find not a lot of difference. Uh, and one question is, especially for young people, and especially after the pandemic, how much of their lives have become digital, and this is just as real for them as might be might feel a bit artificial for people like you and I who are a bit older than young students. So is this a change of a zeitgeist? Is this, I don't know. But at least the first time we got the results, I hated it. I didn't want those results. I wanted to really believe that seeing art in person really makes a difference. So we did it in another museum and we got the same damn thing. So now
So
I'm saying
this,
it's young people.
okay. So it does happen that you don't like the result.
Sure. I mean, that's the thing about doing research is, and this is what I mean about testing our intuitions, is that
Mhm.
just because, if you sit around, at a cocktail party and everybody of a certain age is going to say, and if they're art lovers, are going to say, of course it makes a big difference seeing the thing in person is, why would you even study that? It's so self-evident. But things aren't that feel self-evident sometimes just aren't, and when you start looking at them a little more closely.
But this is so interesting about your work. I really thought, as a scientist, things plan out exactly as you want. So, these experiments that you do, or the research that you do, um, how do you come up with a question?
Yeah, so a mantra in my lab is the question is the question.
Okay.
So we spend a lot of time, because sometimes this research is expensive, both in terms of money, but also in terms of time and people, like, effort of people doing this. So we spend a lot of time trying to figure out, is this a good question for us? Is this advanced line of research we're doing? And is it a tractable question? So there are some questions that might be great questions, but our methods are not going to give us any purchase on the issue. So we spend a lot of time on trying to figure out what the right question is, given the point in time, given what resources we have and how we, and is it building a story? So no, again, this goes back to an earlier part of our conversation of how most experiments then open up new questions. And there's never a single experiment that answers everything, right? This work tends to be incremental, like you're building. And so, you've built a certain thing. Now, what's the next best thing to go after? So that's how it happens. I have weekly lab meetings, and we spend a fair amount of time trying to figure out in the different projects is this worth doing? We critique each other to make sure that we're using our efforts properly. So that's how it goes.
Your thought process, is it always about the research, or what is there sometimes where you switch off and think completely of something different?
Yeah, I mean, I read a lot. I read novels, I read nonfiction. I like being in nature. I think most people, um, you draw from so many different sources, and there are times uh, when you've been working in an area that you set it aside, and later in a completely different context is when you get insights into what you were working on. So that's very common. I find in the morning, before I've had my coffee, when I'm taking a shower, is a good time where things bubble up. Sometimes when I'm exercising, I find things come up that have been rummaging in the back of my mind. So yeah, I think.
Mm. I just a last question. What is the wish for you? What is the dream?
Well, my answer will be not a very elevated one, which is that the dream is that there is a realization that these aesthetic experiences are not something that is nice to have, but is something that we need to have. That it is as important as adequate sleep, as adequate nutrition, adequate exercise, that this is fundamental to our sense of well-being. The non-elevated piece of that is that funding agencies also believe that, because part of my work depends on people willing to put money behind this. And that is the single biggest obstacle for our work, which is that people, at least more in America than in Europe, I think, tend to think of aesthetic experiences and art as uh, kind of as a nice thing to have, if you're wealthy and you don't have anything better to do, then, you play around with paints, or you go to museums and stuff. And so I think there's a general zeitgeist which is changing, but in America, it's thought to be frivolous. So, my wish is that thinking changed with the practical and very venal outcome, which is that people are willing to fund this kind of research.
Amazing. Yeah. No, I totally agree with you. I mean, I read the book where I came across your name, Your Brain on Art, and I also realized that there's so much, information that's needed and that we should know about. And this is people like you who are doing the work behind the scenes that we don't really always realize.
Yeah. Well, I mean, your podcast and things that publicize this always helps. So.
Oh, that's great. But Anjan, thank you so much for your time.
Sure.
It was really such a wonderful conversation.
Yeah, I appreciate your asking me to speak with you.
It's a great pleasure.